Can you only shoot me from my right side? That's my...
Well, you're gonna have to sit that way for the whole thing then, because I'm to your left.
Well, if you turn your back to the audience, it might work.
Oh,
I'm gonna work on my blue steel. Is that the Zoolander's move, right? Blue steel?
My brother-in-law is trying to teach my son to do that.
Oh, that was one of the best movies of all time, I think. No, that was just perfect every single way through.
Like, seriously? I literally just explained that right now.
Do you have to perform it, you movie? I've learned this word tonight to be really, really ridiculous and good looking. God, that's...
so I suspect we'll just give a couple minutes for people to arrive and then we can start. We're talking monsters, so there should be a lot more people. Maybe some of the inhuman as well.
Maybe they're invisible monsters. The room could be full.
It's full, yeah. Ghosts and specters and ghouls that we can't see.
Oh my. Ghosts, specters, and ghouls. Oh my.
Can someone who's near the door, if you don't mind shutting it over just so that the noise doesn't block us out?
It's still open.
So is everyone else
I
pretty
got
tired
like
after
the
this one?
subway side.
Is everyone else pretty tired after? All right, folks. I figure we'll get underway. I'm Derek Newman-Stille. I run the Aurora Award-winning website Speculating Canada. It does reviews, interviews with authors, and general discussions about Canadian SF. And I'm just wondering if we can introduce ourselves. So, do you want to begin, Kevin?
Sure. Hi, I'm Kevin Johns. I'm a author. I have a young adult horror novel, which is probably with a vampire in it, so that's probably why I'm on this panel. I'm also a writing instructor and coach. I work with clients one-on-one. I also have several writing books. It's all downstairs. I forget to bring it up every time, but go to the dealer room, and yeah, so that's me.
I'm Kevin Fischett. I'm an author, publisher, a writing instructor as well, librarian, do a whole bunch of things with books. And for the very first time, so like 8th panel over 2 years, I did bring my book. Because I keep seeing other people do it, and I'm like, yes. So it is a paranormal horror novel with very non-romantic vampires. So I guess that's also why I'm on this panel.
Cool. My name is Timothy Carter. I write mostly sort of young adult far-fetched fiction. This one is not. This one, Section K, is for adults. It's only $5 this weekend. Hint, hint. But I don't know if I've actually written an out horror novel yet, but I am familiar with monsters, and I do try to make fun of them. Book I'm editing right now. The title I'm going with is "I'm So Goddamn Sick of Vampires." So I have high hopes for that one.
Mike Reimer, associate publisher of Under and Press. I'm also a writer. Got a story upcoming on spec. BlackTreacle.ca has a lot of my horror stories right now. That's about it. I'm kind of tired, so I'll be mumbling a lot.
Quickly, coffee, stat. So, I'm wondering if we can do kind of another round, just in terms of what's your relationship to the monstrous, and what really fascinates you about the monster, or a particular monster. So, I guess we'll start with you again, Kevin.
Well, we talked about it a little bit on our panel yesterday, or the Joss Whedon panel, where we were talking about Buffy a bit, and in my storytelling, I certainly approach my use of monsters and scary monsters on, I don't want to say a metaphorical level, but I hope that I'm using them to emphasize real-world fears or issues or challenges, especially as a young adult writer. all those intense kind of melodramatic emotions that young people are feeling with, and the feelings of powerlessness and the feelings of lacking agency and control in your own existence. So I try to use monsters to emphasize those real world feelings and to make a comment on how we deal with the challenges in real life. So I see monsters as more of a tool to elicit emotions that I want to explore in my readers, or with my readers in my characters.
Can you go last?
That was pretty fantastic.
Well, I practiced yesterday. This is the second time I said it. So.
I think of that. I think of bringing my book, man. I think of practicing. Monsters, well, I grew up back in the day where monsters were actually meant to be scary, and I was a huge, huge fan of horror movies and B-movies in general. Growing up, my cousins and I did the ritual watching of the horror movies, all the original, bad, and very good monster movies. I remember Fright Night, the original one, was one of my favorites when I was a tiny kid. And I really, really loved the remake of that, by the way.
So do I, yes. That was an awesome movie.
It was. And also in late high school, early college, Buffy was on television, and I became a diehard fan of Joss Whedon as well. And to me, vampires and other monsters were always meant to be something that was really about, as you say, issues that we deal with as human beings. And the trend of going into more romantic and lessening all of those horrible and horrifying aspects of the nature of monsters kind of really bothered me, because it sort of lost the meaning that they were meant to have. And I never really wrote horror novels before I wrote this one, and I have to admit that putting vampires in it was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to Twilight. And that's all I have to say for now.
Fantastic.
I just like things that kill people.
I do.
That was deep.
But yeah, I like what you said about the feelings of powerlessness there. So I like to typically in my books I avoid the cheerleader and the football jock characters like to play, and I go with the people who are, let's face it, like me when I was in high school. And so then I like creating some terrible monster that hopefully eats the cheerleader and the jock, and then he defeats it, or he or she defeats it. Yes. So yes, I like sort of having those themes, but also just doing things with monsters that maybe other people haven't done, or hoping to do that sort of thing anyway. So I'm something I was going to say, something that you said that I was thinking of. Yeah.
We can always come back to it as well. So just kind of following up on Timothy's points, same deal. Like I found often a lot of social outsiders kind of were represented in or I guess found a greater connection to the monster in various stories, being treated as monsters. And so there was always something appealing about the monster as a figure for representing otherness or the fringe or the outsider. And I think that's kind of what inspired my own research on the representation of disability through the figure of the monster in horror fiction. So,
Yeah, I'm pretty old school with my monsters too. I never really looked to the symbolism of a monster. He's there to scare the crap out of me and kill a lot of people. So, and if he does that, I'm happy. And also, like Tim said, different when you're writing now, because so much is done. You're always looking for a different way to present your monster, whether it's through comedy or humor or just different. Like I wrote a story I thought it was unique at the time, but it wasn't the monster, it was the vampire, but it was the henchman, and how it was basically an origin an origin story of the henchman, how he came. And throughout the story, his boss, vampire, was coming. It's always coming towards him. They were going to meet. But I thought that was, the henchman guy. No one ever writes about the henchman. And I'm like, and it got published and everything. And Emma's like, yeah, it's been done. Yeah, it's been done by me. Now go away.
It's all been done.
It's all been done.
I just think of that, and it makes me feel it's freeing. It's freeing.
Yeah.
Simpsons did it. But the thing I wanted to say is you reminded me of Batman, because you're talking about like vampires that are scary, but then people have them as being all romantic. And I thought, we've got Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight, but then we also have Adam West. People want to look at things in different lights and to tell different stories. And I enjoyed the 60s Batman for what it was, but I also love Christopher Nolan's version. And so I guess not necessarily with Twilight, but other ones where they like with Buffy, where Buffy falls in love with a vampire, and it was a way of sort of taking a different look at the monster, like what's the monster's point of view, and sort of using that as like, what if the monster was the main character, and I think from that got to the idea of, well, what if the monster falls in love with me? Sort of using them in different contexts of going from sort of something scary to something that's just sort of other and misunderstood.
Yeah, you're humanizing the monster.
Mm-hmm.
I can agree to a certain level about like humanizing the monster, and actually there is one of my characters who is not an antagonist. I don't want to say he's a protagonist exactly, but he's sort of on the outside, and he is a monster, and he's not all, I don't want to say tortured and everything, and it's he does have a different perspective, and then the perspective is important to explore as well. I just kind of disagree that you should cut off their fangs, as it were.
Yeah, this is one of the things I often talk about is the defanged monster. So there is something valuable about having a dark monster. But at the same time, I think I love horror fiction, and I'm sure many of you do, that play with those gray areas where you don't need the monster hunter hero. And in fact, I really enjoy fiction where you actually see the inhumanity of the human as a monstrous figure. The human as the monster who is hunting this monstrous figure and kind of rejecting them from society. So I'm wondering about whether we can open that up as well in terms of the discussion of the human as monster. What kind of grim fiction you've read or engaged in that shows the monstrosity of humanity and the victim of the monster.
I was just going to say, you reminded me of Nightbreed, a movie by Clive Barker, and like in the climax of that movie, you've got a bunch of monsters fighting a bunch of humans, and the monsters are, well, not necessarily the good guys, but they're, the humans are definitely the bad guys in that situation, and he really, he was very proud of this, that this was, something he wanted to say, and yeah.
Well, right. Another example I would say right now, if you want to view it right now, is The Walking Dead, where I was explaining my view of The Walking Dead. He said, I don't get these zombies. And I said, well, the zombies at this point are just pretty much part of the wildlife. They're always there. The real monsters is what's happened to the people. I mean, like they're killing each other and they're vicious, and our group, or always running into another group of survivors, and rarely are they good people, and that's exactly the same thing. The zombies are just animals right now that you shoot, they die, and as long as you avoid them, you're okay. It's the people, and you need the people to interact with them, and you can't trust them.
It's almost as though the zombies enter into the space of they can't be held culpable. They're not thinking creatures, but the human beings, they're doing things thoughtfully. And I found in a lot of zombie apocalypse narratives, there's that kind of free space around like what happens if human beings don't have that veneer of civilization. What happens to them?
That's It's
Right.
always been what fascinated me about zombie movies. It was never, ever about the zombies. And I think that's why George Romero's films were so successful.
Yes.
Because it was always about the people. Like, what do you do once there are no rules? And you can see that sometimes people really are evil.
Oh, I was just going to talk about like the Freudian concept of the uncanny, right? Like
Yes.
the concept of the light switch that is neither on nor off, and that's what we get in the vampire figure, even more in the zombie, who's both dead and alive, but also in the vampire, especially who's seems evil but also attractive, or alive but also dead. And so when you're talking about the gray zones, you know, the uncanny is the perfect place to explore that, because the uncanny itself, the fear that comes from the zombie or the vampire, is the very fear of the thing which is not easily categorized, not this or that. It's that gray zone that we get frightened by.
And this actually brings up one of the questions I wanted to ask the panel, which is, because I often see monsters often have historically and continue to represent that weird space where fear and desire meet. We fear the monster because it's a threat to us, but at the same time we envy its freedom, its ability to push away the specter of civilization and kind of do what it wants without any constraints.
Hulk smashed.
Yes, nice. What are some of those monsters where you see that fear and desire really strongly linked? And in what ways does that kind of mixing happen?
I have a fascination with werewolves in that aspect, because I think that as human beings we struggle against an animal nature that we all share, and the werewolf is for me the perfect embodiment of that struggle between, like, well, I want to be civilized, I want to be this and I want to be that, but deep down I really, really want this. And we're all engaged in some kind of fight against this desire that is different for everybody, but we all have one or many. And for me, this is the perfect monster that really represents this, because it's not like for vampires, I absolutely see that fascination as being towards the vampire, because we all have a fascination with predators as well. There, most predators are fascinating, they're magnificent, they're agile, they are just wonderful things to look at. But they're also, tigers are amazing. I would not want to be in a room with one, but they're amazing. And for me, that is what vampires represent. They are possibly gorgeous, mostly they're powerful. And you kind of have to be scared of them, or else they lose that power. And werewolves is more of an internal thing. So they represent the same thing, just not the same way.
And definitely with the vampire, it's kind of a figure that we push away from ourselves to some degree, but see it as an attractive other. Whereas you're right, the werewolf, we see the threat as within, like we could become this monster. But I wonder about the attraction of the vampire in terms of just the image of penetration, right? The fangs going in, the idea of the body becoming permeable. There's something attractive about that, this notion of the mixing of bodies, and not to mention the need, right? Like the vampire needs to eat you in order to survive.
It's a very sexual relationship in nature, in which you want to be subservient and you want to have a position of power in which you are needed.
Yes.
I don't feel that way with mosquitoes, though.
Neither do I. I mean, it's just, But then you can swat a mosquito. What are you going to do with a vampire? I mean,
Well, the question is, do they make you itchy after? Because they have an anticoagulant.
I think we're going back to the sexual thing, but in a very nasty way.
in a non-sex, to take it away from sex for a moment. Oh, my apologies.
Everyone's tired. Sex is really
No, but I mean, I think the vampire is kind of a modern myth that comes from beginning to understand the kind of violence we have inherent in ourselves and the violence we want to overcome. And even just in terms of, unless you're a vegetarian, we all stay alive by drinking blood to a certain extent in the meats that we eat and the living protein that we consume. And I think as we start thinking about things like what are the moral implications of that, as vegetarian eating or vegan or whatever, or conscious eating, spreads, like these ideas of a monster is sometimes also just a mirror of our own actions and makes us think about them. What does it mean that the reason I'm able to carry on is because I've killed a cow this morning and ate it? Or what does it mean that I'm able to get to work because we mowed down all the trees and built roads over them, right? There's something monstrous in our very behavior as modern human beings, and I think sometimes vampires and other monsters are a way of trying to deal with that or understand that. This kind of moral ambiguity that we carry with us everywhere where we go, but don't really consciously address very often, and rather, going back to Freud, kind of returns in the return of the repressed, right? Where in the form of these vampires or other monsters.
Especially in terms of the idea of hunger, I think you really touched on something nice there, because we have, like, hunger creates a desire in us, we desire to eat, but at the same time, we fear that hunger. We have to ignore all the damage that it does, the mowing down of trees, the mowing down of animals, the creation of farms. In many ways, we have to distance ourselves from that, what our hunger actually does to the natural world.
Well, it's also that, and the fact that we are something completely other than the product of our environment. The natural environment, because to a certain point we are, but we really are not anymore. We haven't been for generations and generations and generations. And also, what does that mean? Put it very, very simple.
Well, I, like the vampires too, in that they have that immortality thing happening and the sexuality thing happening. I'm pretty twisted that way, so. But on the whole, there's nothing that I emulate or associate with monsters, the cursed beings. Even the vampires, that's the at heart, there's a give and take, always the give and take with the werewolf, with the vampire, or if it's just a weird creature that happens to pop up and be bad. So for me, I don't really associate or I like the monster for being a monster, but I don't want to be one. They're the bad guys. They need to be put down. Even the zombies, I can't. They're just there, get them rid of them. I don't know what. My fear is, someday there's going to be zombies, and that head thing isn't going to work. What are you going to do?
Keep chopping.
Yeah.
When you get out the lawnmower.
Yeah, it's like.
And you do that thing, with the treadmills around your house.
Just keep them walking.
Just keep them walking.
One thing I like about monsters too is they can really simplify things. Like a certain type of monster could be a giant robot. I loved Transformers when I was growing. I still love them now. And I always loved in the show, you never had a story where, Optimus Prime was going to take Megatron to court and, try and, build a strong case against why Megatron should, pay him damages for a thing. No, he went after him with a laser cannon, and Megatron did the same thing back. I like the simplicity that came with those types of stories. And because sometimes when you cut out a lot of the really complicated stuff, then you do get down to sort of, what are people, all, the characters on both sides really all about.
That's a great point, because we were talking earlier about monsters helping us to address these gray spaces, but sometimes you're right, monsters are also used to make things black and white and to address our desire to not take bad guys to court. The zombie allows us to just blow the bad guy's head off. In Buffy, we murder the vampire and it just turns to dust, right? We don't even have a body to deal with. So that's absolutely true. I think sometimes monsters are used to make things more complex, but you're right, sometimes it feeds that simple desire of that bloodlust for for justice, where we just kill the bad guys. We don't take them to court. We just chop their head off because they're monsters, right? I think you're right. I think a lot of the speculative fiction and horror fiction that we read or experience in movies is about kind of addressing that base violent desire within us to really see the bad guys in society, or the monsters who we deem to be monsters, just murdered, without consequence, right? Because it becomes a heroic act. It turns the violence that we all know to be morally reprehensible in the real world into a heroic act.
Yeah, I mean, when you're watching an action movie, you don't really want, the hero to, capture the villain and put him in handcuffs and take him to court and then, go through the whole. No, you want to see him shoot the bad guy, or throw him off a bridge or something like that, and have that heroic moment of, killing the bad guy. Which, when you think about it, is actually kind of monstrous in itself. But it's sort of it's that catharsis. It's the instant justice you can do in that type of story there. But because real life is a lot more complicated.
Well, I was just gonna say, I like that you mentioned Buffy in that, because they often do both. They talk about how complicated some things are in the overarching story arc, and how awesome and simple it is to just kill vampires. And I really, really enjoy that about Joss Whedon. And I'm not gonna go back into Joss Whedon because we had an entire different
Sure,
channel
no,
about
but I
that.
mean, I
But
think-
it is important to address, and I think the best horror stories do that.
Yeah. Well, and there is that whole background of Buffy that these people have the original Watchers took some poor girl and tied her up and put a monster into her and turned her into this killing machine, right? So yeah.
I will say also, one of the things that Stephen King says repeatedly is that horror is essentially conservative. And I think that ties into this discussion of the kind of black and white morality, because when Stephen King is writing, what he assumes most horror writers are doing is to give you an opponent, something that you fear, that you don't trust because it's different and weird, and then have you destroy it. So there's a sense of return to normalcy. The monster represents that abnormal element, and so it's interesting to see the way people do different readings of horror as well. Because I find, even in the Stephen King style monstrosity, I would often really like the monster because they always represented that fringe component that he found threatening.
Well, and you think of Jason Voorhees, right? Who's this disfigured child who's mocked and ignored, and the camp counselors are off having sex while he drowns. And maybe I'm just twisted, but I always kind of relate with Jason in the Friday the 13th movies, right? There's something, cathartic about seeing the irresponsible counselors get what's coming to them, and the poor freak boy get his revenge. And I think that's why, marginalized and kind of outsiders, especially teens, but I mean guys throughout life are often drawn to horror and sci-fi and stuff, right? Is that there is like you mentioned, seeing the jock and the cheerleader get it, right, is something that perhaps someone who's been ostracized by that group might enjoy watching.
Yeah, well, Jason was always the monster in the cloud, the boogeyman, right? Essentially, when you're a parent, you tell your kid, eat your vegetables, and someone will get you. That's what Jason and Michael Myers and all them are, because the whole subtextual premarital sex is bad. This is what happens. Or if you're doing drugs, because that's all the one. If you're having sex, the one's having sex, the likable funny guy always goes first. I mean, there is a certain but they all have bad teenage traits, and Jason and Michael are justice in a moral justice in an abstract sense, in that everyone who's doing something bad is going to get it by a monster.
And there's sort of two sides of that, because it's always the let's worry about the freak. That's where the danger is going to come from. It's not going to come from the normal people. And just when you hear about school shootings, and then schools respond by looking for the freaks to try and make sure that they're not going to snap under the pressure that all the other students are putting them under. And whether it's, you think, well, shouldn't it go the other way? Go after all the monsters who basically created the monster who decided one day to come back to school with a gun? Or do you just say, well, it's much, do you go after all of these people who are popular and, do sports that's good for the school? Or do you just go after that guy who can't even defend himself anyway, unless, of course, he snaps and, brings a gun?
He's the immediate
Well,
threat.
which is easier? Which is easier to deal with and has virtually no consequences? Think.
One
And-
simple solution, target
Yeah.
one individual rather than looking at the social system
Mhm.
that created this issue.
Mhm.
As we're talking about this, I'm reminded of a particular monster, Harvard, talking about committing sociology. And I'm like, we need to commit some sociology in schools. We need to look at the wider social issues that are creating patterns where people become monsters, where they're so ostracized by the system that they are lost and resort to violence.
And it goes back to the issue of powerlessness that we were talking about, because the people who bullied me, the thing that I always noticed was they bullied me because they could. It wasn't that they had a need, well, maybe they did, but it wasn't. All it was just they realized he's weaker than me, therefore I can do what I want without consequence. And what's he going to do? Rat to the teachers? They'll just tell him to toughen up.
Yeah.
And so on. Yeah, a lot of my fiction draws on that kind of stuff. The big unconquerable, who's unconquerable because he's bigger and stronger. And then, a character like me who kicks his ass. Just spending the rest of my life trying to make up for high school, just like Joss Whedon.
Probably why we're all young adult authors. We all had miserable high school experiences. We're in our 30s and 40s still trying to work through.
And that says a lot about our society, that people can still feel pained by something that happened to them 20, 30 years ago, and it's like people can recognize, yes, that a lot of people will have this, but what are you going to do? It's high school. Everyone feels bad about high school. Well, it doesn't have to be. You could sort of try and work on making it better, but that's hard.
Yeah.
Just along this line, I was thinking of the way that one can actually tell a lot about a society by the monsters it creates. We have here a symbolic form for all of our taboo, our anxiety,